She walked into that room, and not one of them stood up. 5 of the most dangerous men in the world, seated behind a table of dark mahogany imported from Seoul, and not one of them stood up. She was a black woman, a criminal defense attorney who had fought her way into every room that was built to keep her out. She had married the man they called the Dragon of Seoul, the Korean mafia boss whose neck tattoo told you everything you needed to know before he ever opened his mouth. And she had loved him before she fully understood what loving him would cost her. The patriarch had flown in from Korea personally. Tae-sung, 71 years old, white hair, cold eyes, a man who had not left Seoul in 4 years, came specifically to erase her. He looked at her like she was a mistake his grandson had made. And then he spoke, in Korean, without even the courtesy of pretending she was worth addressing directly. He said she should not be here, that the marriage was a disgrace, that she needed to be removed like a problem, like a miscalculation, like something that had never belonged. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that while they were busy planning how to destroy her, she had already found the one secret capable of bringing their entire empire to its knees. She reached into that small ruby-red clutch, placed a single folded document on the mahogany table, pressed her hand down on it slowly, and smiled. That smile changed everything. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and click Join to become a member and help our channel. There is a kind of silence that does not mean peace. It is the silence of a room where every person present has already decided something, and no one has spoken it aloud yet. It is the silence that fills a space just before an agreement becomes a verdict, just before a guest becomes a prisoner, just before the people who believe they hold all the power realize too late that power was never truly in their hands. That was the silence inside the private dining room of Jang's on Peachtree, the flagship restaurant of an empire that, on paper, served the finest Korean cuisine in Atlanta, and that, behind every lacquered wall and every carefully selected painting, served something far more permanent and far more dangerous. She walked in, and they did not stand. 5 men, seated behind a table of dark mahogany that had been imported from a supplier in Seoul at a cost that would have paid a year of salaries for most families in the neighborhood outside. 5 men whose combined decisions had shaped the movement of money, territory, and silence across 2 continents for the better part of 3 decades. 5 men who had, before she arrived, already agreed on what she was. An intrusion, a miscalculation, a problem that their leader, their blood, their chosen successor, had introduced into a system that had survived precisely because it never tolerated variables it had not vetted, approved, and controlled. She was all 3. And she walked in wearing wine-dark fabric that fit her like authority. Gold catching the low light at her ears, at her throat, at the small rectangular clutch she held in one hand, with the easy confidence of someone who had walked into hostile rooms before and understood that the most dangerous thing you could do in a room that wanted you afraid was to refuse, quietly, completely, without drama, to be afraid at all. Her name was Destiny Renee Calloway. And if you had asked any one of those 5 men in that moment what she represented, they would have told you she was a mistake. They would have been wrong. But they did not know that yet. And the not knowing, that specific, proud, absolute certainty, that they already understood everything about what they were looking at. That was the thing that would cost them everything. At the head of the table sat the man who had built all of this, Jang Tae-sung, 71 years old, white hair pulled back from a face that time had pressed like a seal into stone. Hard lines, flat affect, the particular kind of stillness that belongs to men who have given orders that ended lives and have long since made their peace with that fact. He wore black, traditional fabric, gold at the edges, the kind of garment that does not travel across an ocean unless the man wearing it intends for his presence to function as a declaration. He had come from Seoul for this. That was the detail that no one outside that room fully understood. Tae-sung did not travel. Tae-sung had not left South Korea in 4 years. The organization moved around him like water around a stone. Everyone else traveled. Everyone else adjusted. Everyone else came to where he was. He had come here, which meant that whatever he believed this woman represented, he believed it was serious enough to require his physical presence, his body in the room as a statement, his silence as a sentence. He looked at her for a long time before he spoke, and she looked back. Her hair fell over her shoulders in long, shining curls, dark and defined, catching light the way things do when they are genuinely cared for, when someone has chosen them deliberately and tended to them with intention. Her skin was the color of honey held to the sun, smooth and warm and entirely unbothered by the cold pressure filling the room around her. Her eyes were steady, not defiant, not pleading, just present, just entirely, quietly, dangerously present. The patriarch finally spoke, in Korean, without looking at his grandson, who stood near the door with his arms crossed and his face arranged into the practiced neutrality of a man who has learned that the most powerful thing he can do in a negotiation is appear to feel nothing. What Tae-sung said, translated, was this: she should not be here. And Destiny, who had understood more than any of them suspected, did not flinch. She set the clutch on the table, clasped her hands in front of her, and smiled. The precise, measured smile of a woman who has already won the argument and is simply waiting for the other party to realize it. There is something that experienced men of power share, regardless of the language they speak or the flag under which they built their empires. It is a particular form of blindness, not the blindness of ignorance, but the blindness of certainty. The absolute, load-bearing conviction that the architecture of the world they have constructed is sound, because they constructed it, and because it has held until now. Tae-sung had that blindness. He had earned it, in the way that men of his generation and his particular history earned things, through sacrifice that most people in that room could not imagine, through decisions made in rooms far darker and far more dangerous than this one, through decades of watching every person who had underestimated him eventually understand, at great personal cost, exactly what that underestimation had bought them. He had built the Hukkinyong from the wreckage of a Korea still bleeding from a war that had split it in half. He had taken the underground networks that formed in the chaos of the post-war economy, the black markets, the back-channel trade routes, the quiet arrangements between desperate men and desperate institutions, and he had organized them, formalized them, given them structure and hierarchy and a set of rules that, however brutal in their enforcement, had provided a kind of order that the legitimate world around them failed to offer. He had done this across 50 years. And in 50 years, he had never once made a decision that the elders of the organization had not, eventually, recognized as correct. This was what he was thinking when he looked at Destiny Renee Calloway. He was not thinking about her. He was thinking about the record, the unbroken half-century record of being right. And this woman, this specific, unvetted, unapproved variable that his grandson had introduced into the center of the organization's American operation, was not a person to him in that moment. She was a test of the record, an anomaly to be corrected so that the record could continue. What he did not know, what none of them knew, what not even Min Jae fully knew, was that Destiny had understood this before she ever walked into the room. She had understood it the way she understood everything, methodically, without ego, by studying the structure of the thing rather than the surface of it. She had spent 8 months as the wife of Jung Min Jae, learning not just the man, but the machine around him. The way information moved, the way decisions were deferred, the way every public-facing element of the organization, the restaurants, the gallery, the import business, functioned as a membrane between what the world was allowed to see and what actually happened behind it. She had not done this because she suspected danger. She had done it because she was a criminal defense attorney, and criminal defense attorneys survive by understanding systems before those systems turn against their clients. It was habit. It was instinct. It was the same reflex that made her read every contract before signing, map every courtroom before entering, know the judge's history before the first hearing. She had simply applied that reflex to her own life. And what she had found, buried inside the financial architecture of an organization that prided itself on airtight discretion, was a thread. Small at first, an irregularity in a transfer record that she had accessed through documents Min Jae had left open on his office desk one evening. Not carelessly, she now understood, but with the exhausted trust of a man who had no one else in the world he could fully hand something to. She had not meant to look. Then she had looked, and the thread had led, with the quiet inevitability of all genuinely important discoveries, to something enormous. 12 years of internal diversion, not external theft, not a rival organization bleeding the Hyukin-yong from the outside. Internal, deliberate, sustained over more than a decade with the kind of patience that only someone at the very top of a structure could maintain, because only someone at the very top would never be audited, never be questioned, never be asked to account for the movement of funds that everyone below simply assumed were moving for reasons that were none of their business. Taesung had been stealing from his own organization. Not taking, stealing. Diverting funds away from the collective accounts of the regional leaders. The men sitting at this very table. The men who had built their own operations on the foundational promise that the patriarch's stewardship of the whole was honest. And routing them through a sequence of shell accounts and legitimate business transactions so carefully layered that it had taken her 3 weeks of methodical unwinding to trace it fully. Into the maintenance of a second life. A second family. In Busan. A woman. 2 children, now grown. A home. An existence that Taesung had funded for 30 years with money that did not belong to him. She had the documentation. Every transfer. Every account. Every connection between the shell entities and the final destination. It was, professionally speaking, the cleanest evidence package she had ever assembled. And she had assembled evidence packages that had freed men the entire state of Georgia had been certain were guilty. When the patriarch finished his statement, the one about how she should not be here, and the room settled back into that particular silence that expected her to respond with either deference or distress, Destiny reached into the gold clutch on the table. She removed a single folded document. She placed it in the center of the table. She did not push it toward anyone. She did not explain it. She simply left it there, returned her hands to their folded position, and said, in English, in the voice she used when she was giving a jury the last thing she wanted them to carry into deliberations, "Before anyone in this room makes a decision about who belongs here and who doesn't, I think it would be worth reading that." The silence that followed was a different kind than the one that had greeted her arrival. That first silence had been the silence of certainty. This one was the silence of men beginning, slowly and against their will, to understand that certainty had just become a much more complicated thing. There is a specific moment in every room where power lives, a moment that does not announce itself, does not arrive with noise or gesture or any of the visible theater that people associate with shifts in authority. It arrives quietly. It arrives in the half-second between when someone says something and when the people around them process what has been said. It arrives in the way eyes move, not toward the person speaking, but toward the person who has the most to lose from what was just spoken. Every eye in that room moved toward Tae-sung. He had not touched the document. It sat in the center of the mahogany table like something that had always been there, like something the table had been built around, like the fixed point of a room that was now, quietly, irreversibly reorganizing itself in relation to that single, folded page. The other four elders looked at it the way people look at objects they have not yet decided are dangerous, with the careful, lateral attention of men who have survived long enough to know that the things most worth fearing rarely look like weapons until they are already in use. Tae-sung looked at Destiny, and for the first time since she had entered the room, something moved behind his eyes. Not fear, not yet. Something that preceded fear. The faint, deep register of a man whose internal architecture has just received information that does not fit the structure he has built his certainty upon, and who has not yet decided how to absorb it. He knew what was in that document before he opened it. Not the specifics, not the account numbers, not the transfer sequences, not the name of the woman in Busan or the ages of the children he had never publicly acknowledged. He did not know those specifics. But he knew the category. He knew the shape of the thing. Because a man who has hidden something for 12 years carries the knowledge of that hiding the way a body carries an old injury. Not always consciously, not always painfully, but always present. Always slightly affecting the way he moves through rooms and decisions, and the specific vulnerability of being truly, deeply known. He had never been known. That had been his greatest protection, and though he would never have articulated it this way, his greatest loneliness. He reached out and picked up the document. The room did not breathe. He unfolded it slowly, with the hands of a man who has handled difficult things before, and has learned that the speed at which you open something communicates more than the expression on your face when you see what is inside. He read it. His face did not change. His posture did not shift. The jade-handled cane rested against the edge of the table exactly as it had before, at exactly the same angle. And if you had been watching from outside the room through glass, you might have concluded that nothing of consequence had occurred. But Min-jae was not watching from outside. Min-jae was standing near the door with his arms still crossed, the dragon on his neck still and dark against his skin, and he was watching his grandfather's hands, specifically the way the paper moved between them, a tremor so faint it was almost nothing, almost imperceptible, the kind of tremor that does not come from age or illness, but from the specific physiological experience of a body that has just been asked to hold more than it was prepared to hold. Min-jae had seen his grandfather's hands for 34 years. He had never seen them tremble. He looked at Destiny. She was not watching Tae-sung. She was watching the other 4 elders, reading them the way she read juries, cataloging the micro-expressions, the repositioning of shoulders, the way one of the men had placed both palms flat on the table in front of him in the unconscious posture of someone who is preparing to push back from something. She was already 3 moves ahead. She had been 3 moves ahead since she walked through the door, and the room was only now beginning to understand that the game they thought they had been playing had different rules than the ones they had assumed at the start. One of the elders, the one to Taesong's left, a broad-shouldered man named Park, who controlled the organization's West Coast operations, and who had, at the beginning of this meeting, been the most visibly contemptuous of her presence, leaned forward and spoke in Korean, his voice low and tight and directed entirely at the patriarch. He asked a question. He asked it the way men ask questions when they already know the answer is going to require them to completely restructure something they believed was permanent. Taesong did not answer immediately. He folded the document, placed it back on the table, pressed one hand flat on top of it, not returning it to the center, not sliding it back toward destiny, but keeping it under his palm, keeping it close. The instinct of a man who understands, even now, that controlling the physical object is the last form of control available to him in this moment. Then he looked at Destiny again, and this time, the look was different from every look that had come before it. It was not the look he had given her when she entered, that flat, categorical dismissal, the look of a man glancing at something he has already classified and set aside. It was not the guarded, recalibrating look of the moment after she placed the document on the table. It was something more specific and more difficult than either of those things. It was the look of a man who is, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely uncertain. Not about the document, not about what it contained or what she could do with it. He was certain about all of that. What he was uncertain about, what was moving through him in that moment with the slow, heavy quality of something that changes the landscape it passes through, was something more fundamental. He was uncertain about whether he had misjudged her. Not whether she was dangerous. She was clearly dangerous. That was no longer in question. Whether he had misjudged what kind of dangerous she was. Because the woman sitting across from him had not come into this room with the document as a weapon. She had come with it as a boundary. There was a difference. A crucial, structural difference that a man of his experience understood immediately once he was forced to look at it clearly. A weapon is designed to destroy. A boundary is designed to define. She had not walked in here to burn the organization down. She had walked in here to tell them, in the clearest possible language, exactly where she stood, and exactly what the cost would be of continuing to pretend that she did not belong here. She was not threatening them. She was negotiating. And the terrible, quiet, pride-dismantling realization that was settling over Taesong in that moment, the realization he would spend the rest of the evening trying to fully absorb, was that she was negotiating better than anyone he had sat across from in 50 years of doing exactly this. "I want to be clear," Destiny said, into the silence that had stretched long enough that speaking into it felt like placing something solid into open water. Her voice was even. Not cold. Warmth lived in it. The particular warmth of someone who has no need to perform cruelty, because the substance of what they are saying is already doing all the necessary work. "I am not here because I want to destroy anything. I am here because I am already part of this. And I think, if everyone in this room is honest with themselves, they know that the most expensive thing they could do right now is continue pretending otherwise." Nobody spoke. Outside, Atlanta moved through its evening with complete indifference to the conversation happening inside this room. Traffic. rain beginning on the windows, the muffled sound of the restaurant's kitchen, the legitimate, fragrant, ordinary business of feeding people, operating one floor below them as it always had, as it would tomorrow, as the whole careful surface of this empire would continue to operate regardless of what was decided here. The question was only, who would be deciding? There is a thing that happens to empires. All empires, regardless of their size or their legitimacy or the particular form of power they are built upon, that the people inside them almost never see coming, because the nature of the thing makes it invisible from the inside. It is not invasion. It is not collapse. It is not the dramatic, sudden rupture that history tends to remember and mythology tends to celebrate. It is recalibration. The quiet, structural, load-bearing moment when the system that has operated according to one set of assumptions is forced, not by violence, not by revolution, but by the simple, irresistible pressure of reality to reorganize itself around a new center of gravity. The walls do not fall. The foundation does not crack. Everything looks, from the outside, exactly as it looked before. But something essential has shifted, and everyone inside knows it, even if no one will say it aloud for a very long time. That was what happened in the private dining room of Jang's on Peachtree on an ordinary Atlanta evening, while the rain moved in off the highway, and the kitchen one floor below filled the building with the smell of something warm and ordinary and entirely unaware of what was being decided above it. Tai-sung sat with his hand still pressed flat on the document. He was a man who had, over the course of 50 years, made decisions that most people in his position would have delegated. Decisions about territory, about succession, about the particular and irreversible consequences that follow when someone inside the organization breaks the compact of loyalty that holds the whole structure together. He had made those decisions with the calm of someone who understood that authority, genuine authority, is not the ability to inspire fear. It is the ability to act when action is required, without requiring the permission of your own emotions to do so. He had always been able to do that. He was finding, in this moment, that it was more difficult than it had ever been. Not because he was afraid of destiny, not because the document frightened him. He had survived exposure before, in forms far more public and far more immediately dangerous than this. What made this difficult was something he had not anticipated and could not have prepared for, because it required him to hold two things simultaneously that his entire life had been structured to keep separate. She was right. Not about everything. Not in every detail of every implication she had laid before this room, but in the essential, structural claim that sat beneath everything else she had said. The claim that she was already part of this, that the attempt to remove her was not a correction, but a miscalculation, that the organization's survival in its American operation was more entangled with her presence and her competence and her specific, formidable intelligence than any of them had been willing to admit. In that claim, she was simply, undeniably, correct. And Chang Tae-sung had built 50 years of authority on one foundational principle above all others. He did not ignore correct. He sat with that for a long moment, long enough that Park, on his left, shifted in his seat, long enough that one of the other elders exchanged a glance with the man beside him, quick, sidelong, the look of people who are waiting for a signal and beginning to wonder if the signal is going to come in a form they recognize. Long enough that Min Jae, still standing near the door, slowly uncrossed his arms. Then Tae-sung lifted his hand from the document. He did not push it back toward destiny. He left it where it was, in the center of the table, equidistant between them, belonging to neither and both. The way the most important things in any negotiation always end up belonging to the space between the parties, rather than to either side of it. He spoke. In Korean first, to the room. 4 sentences, measured and final, in the tone he used when a decision had been made and what followed was not discussion, but implementation. The elders received it the way they received all his directives, without visible reaction, with the particular stillness of men who have long since learned that their responses to his words are themselves a form of information that he is always collecting and evaluating. Then he looked at Destiny, and he spoke in English. His English was precise and lightly accented, and far better than he had ever allowed anyone outside his innermost circle to know, because a man who controls what others believe about his limit, quiet joy of watching someone you love be fully seen by a world that tried very hard not to see them. He thought about the night before, her hair against the pillow, the way she had held the pen drive in her hand and looked at him with those steady, dark eyes and said, "I needed to know if you would tell me." The way that single sentence had contained, inside it, an entire architecture of trust. Not the blind trust of someone who has never been hurt, but the chosen, deliberate, clear-eyed trust of someone who has been hurt before and has decided, with full knowledge of the risk, to trust anyway. He had told her. She had been worth telling. Destiny did not stand immediately. She remained seated for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to make clear that she was not rising in response to them, not performing gratitude or relief, or any of the emotions that the room might have expected from a woman who had just navigated what she had just navigated. She rose because she was ready to rise, because the meeting, on her terms, was complete. She picked up the gold clutch from the table. She picked up the document, folded it, returned it to the clutch, closed the clasp with a soft, final click that was the only sound in the room at that moment, and that landed, in the silence, with more weight than anything that had been said. She looked at Taesong. "I look forward to working with you," she said. Not, "I hope we can move forward." Not, "Thank you for your time." Not any of the softening, deferential language that the room had been structured, from the beginning, to extract from her. "I look forward to working with you." A statement of future fact, a door already open and already walked through. Taesong said nothing. But as Destiny turned and walked toward the door, toward Min-jae, who held it open for her with his hand warm on the small of her back, the gold watch catching the last of the light, the patriarch watched her go with the expression of a man who is thinking something that he will not say aloud tonight. Possibly will not say aloud for a long time, but that has nonetheless already become true in the place where true things live before they are spoken. He had come to Atlanta to correct a mistake. He was leaving with the quiet, irrefutable understanding that the mistake had not been the marriage. The mistake had been the assumption. The assumption that the woman his grandson had chosen was defined by what she was not. Not Korean, not pale, not silent, not submissive, not the shape of the space they had prepared for her, rather than by what she was. What she was had just rewritten, in the space of a single evening, the rules of an organization that had not changed its rules in 50 years. Outside, Atlanta received the rain without complaint. The restaurant below them continued its warm, fragrant, ordinary work. And somewhere in the city, in the specific and unremarkable way that history always actually moves, not in monuments or declarations, but in rooms like this one, in moments like this one, in the quiet aftermath of a door closing behind a woman who had walked in as an intrusion and walked out as the most important person in the building. Something had permanently changed. Nobody announced it. Nobody needed to. The room already knew.
The problem begins when confusion becomes your normal. when you no longer know whether you are being loved or simply being kept around. When you start normalizing signs that hurt, silence that drains you, and doubt that steals your peace. If that spoke to you, I left a path to help you recognize this pattern sooner, stop abandoning yourself, and trust yourself again. You can access it now through the QR code on the screen, the link in the description, or the pinned comment.
If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever walked into a room that was designed to make you feel like you didn't belong, and had to choose between shrinking to survive or standing fully in who you are? Have you ever been judged, not for what you've done, not for who you are, but simply for what you look like, where you come from, or who you chose to love? And have you ever watched someone underestimate you so completely that their own certainty became the very thing that handed you the power they were trying to keep from you? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, truth, and the kind of courage that doesn't make noise but changes everything, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click Join to become a part of our community and help the channel.